All right. Welcome, everybody, to Adult Religious Ed on a Tuesday evening. My name's Claire Costello. I'm going to be the facilitator for the night. And thank you to the wonderful Carrie Shakely, who's going to be our Zoom tech coordinator. I'm going to start out with some opening words from Thich Nhat Hanh. And they are this. Much of our suffering comes from wrong perceptions. To remove that hurt, we have to remove our wrong perception. When you make the effort to listen and hear the other side of the story, your understanding increases and your hurt diminishes. All right, wonderful. So we have an excellent speaker here with us tonight. Gareth Young is going to speak to us about Buddhism as a part of our Neighboring Faith series. Just a little bit about Gareth. He's a meditation teacher, a businessman, and a co-founder of Red Clay Sangha. And he's maintained a committed meditation practice for over 20 years in the Zen and Vipassana traditions, and integrates over 10 years of interfaith engagement, as well as teachings from Tibetan and Lotus Sutra traditions into his practice and life. He has received a full teaching authorization from the Thai forest lineage of Ajahn Chah, Dak Cornfield, and Lisa Ernst, and is a firm advocate of the principles and practices of one Dharma. He lives in the Atlanta area with his wife and their dogs, chickens, and bees, and he has 2 adult children. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Gareth, and we'll hear a little bit about Buddhism. Thank you so much, Gareth.
Thank you, Claire. Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. I generally find that these kind of presentations work out better as conversations than as presentations. So what I will do is just give you a very brief personal history of my relationship with Buddhism, so you know how I came to be here. That will probably answer some of the questions you have, and we'll put some of the other questions firmly on the side as things I know nothing about because of how I came here. And then we'll just have like popcorn questions, just ask questions. If you have questions about the faith, nothing is off limits. I was raised, as you can tell from my peculiar accent, a long way away. And it was in a country where the state religion was Christianity, Church of England. So I was raised in with that as kind of a distant faith. I was never very involved in it. As I grew into adulthood, my faith really became science. So it's like Big Bang and evolution, and I moved into business. And then along the way, when I had 2 young children, I had one of those experiences where I kind of stubbed my toe spiritually and realized I was missing stuff. And there's a longer version of the story where I can tell you how all that happened. But the long and the short of it is, I took up a meditation practice. After a couple of years of meditating, realized I needed guidance. I needed somebody who'd been there before, and I needed a community to practice with. And there were a number of different options, I guess, with hindsight, but I fairly quickly stumbled into a Zen Buddhist group, which is here in Atlanta. I was with that group for, goodness, 10 years, 15 years, something like that. And I was actually ordained a Zen Buddhist priest. Left that community, and it was largely a westernized community. So it was American, sort of European Americans, if you will, and dominantly white European Americans. And then left that group a little over 10 years ago. And we founded, as Claire said in the bio, a community called Red Clay Sangha, which is still my home community, if you will. And we're mostly mature adults, mostly mature white adults again. So that's how I came to be here. And then I, about 15 years ago, got heavily involved in interfaith. Again, it was an accidental encounter, and it appealed to me. I got very involved. I have several times of the Ramadan, the Jewish high holies. I've been on many international and national interfaith trips and so on and so forth. So that's a very important part of my life. So that's how I came to be here. Questions about Buddhism? What misconceptions do you? That's the wrong word. What perceptions do you have of Buddhism? What questions do you have of Buddhism? Where do you have curiosity about it? Questions? Anybody?
For people with questions, if you would like to raise your hands. Okay, great.
What are my core beliefs? That's a really tricky question. Buddhism is not a tradition. So one of the things Buddha said on his deathbed was, don't believe a word I say, go practice, go try, go find it yourself. In many ways, Buddhism offers a set of practices that allows an individual to find their way to the truth, if you will. One of the axiomatic principles of Buddhism is was kind of the related to the Thich Nhat Hanh quote. We just don't see things very clearly. We think we see the world, but we don't. Buddha means the awakened one. A translation of but, which is the root, is to wake up. And it's like we wake up in the morning from our nighttime dreams and we see this world and we realize that was a dream. And we can wake up from this dream and see the world as it really is. And another version of our suffering, which Claire said at the beginning, is suffering, our discontent, our dis-ease, is the gap between the way things are and the way we want them to be. And that's all around the stories we tell ourselves. So I will quote somebody out of the Hindu tradition, Nisargadatta. He says, when I know that I am nothing, that is wisdom. When I know that I am everything, that is love or compassion. And between these two shores, my life flows. So that nothing is not a nihilistic nothingness. It's the nothingness of St. John of the Cross, or Teresa of Avila, or the cloud of the unknowing. It's a no thingness. It's this formlessness, this potential, this possibility. So to know that that is my essence is wisdom. It's to not have any stories I hold on to know that I am everything, as Thomas Merton, when Thomas Merton left Gethsemane one day, he walked down the street, they let them out every once in a blue moon, and he walked down the street and he kind of collapsed. He said, oh my goodness, you're God and you're God and you're God. If only you knew. And that's one of those opening experiences of we're all connected, and that's compassion. And so beliefs, I have faith in the practice that if I follow a practice of meditation, of awareness and mindfulness, of cultivating compassion, it will make me more useful in the world. It will reduce my suffering, and it will reduce the suffering in the world at large. I have faith that there really is a form of dissolution of the self, which, and again, it's not into nothingness, it's into no thingness. But there is a dissolution of the self that comes at the end of that practice. And it's the same as the loss of self that's talked about in all the world's great faiths, I think. And one of the practices, one of the experiences of Buddhism is, as we continue with our practice, we get little glimpses to say, ah, that's reassuring. Yeah, there is something here. So it's a rather long answer to the question, but there's the answer. There was another question I saw pop up, Claire.
Well, Kay, would you like to ask your question with your hand up?
It seems, there's a lot of forms of Christianity.
Yeah.
And there's several forms of the Muslim community and the Catholic. But it seems to me that my sense is, and it just may be the core of Buddhism, is that there's like 1,000 forms of Buddhism.
I think you dramatically understate the number. Yeah. So yes, that's true. And I'll give you a little canned history of Buddhism, which explains some of that, and along the way, I'll explain how that happens. There's a guy in India 2,500 years ago, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. He woke up and he became the Buddha. So the teachings of Buddhism came out of that practice. And it was an oral tradition for probably 500 years. So as you can imagine, an oral tradition with people wandering around over an area of several hundred, maybe a few thousand miles, it can, it doesn't just shift, but it can separate, right? So even in India, that started to happen. There were reform movements coming out of that, where some groups of people looked at what was going on in one place and said, well, that's ridiculous. So you had this was going on in early Buddhism, and that led to the emergence of there's a large movement called the Mahayana Tradition, which was more centered intentionally on compassion. It was intentionally centered on, this is not about waking up yourself. This is about getting into the world and helping everybody else with their suffering. So that was already there in the original Buddhism, but in some of the strands, it kind of got buried a little bit. So there was this movement to re-energize around that. So then Buddhism started to spread. And then it went up the Silk Road into Tibet. And in Tibet, you've got the Burn tradition, which is a very old tradition. And they had practices, the Dzogchen practices are a very deep sort of objectless meditation practice. They have a whole variety of visualization practices. So all those magnificent colored pictures you see of these demons and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas sitting on lotuses, and these very complicated pictures of netherworlds and all the rest. Those are all the Tibetan practice, and heavily influenced by this original Burn tradition. Kept going and went into China. And in China, you have Confucianism and Taoism, and you have fundamental belief in there. So in India, there was an accepted tradition where people would live the 4 stages of life, and the 4th stage of life was just to go off into the woods. It was like you've been a student, you've been a householder. Now you've done your job. Okay, time to go off on your spiritual quest. So there's an accepted place where people just went off and did this anyway. In China, the tradition was very much more based on the Confucian, or interwoven with the Confucian system of you got to work. You can't just go off to a monastery. You got to stay engaged. So the traditions that grew up in China were much more centered in the world. And there are a number of traditions. One of the big shifts that happened is this thing called Buddha nature started popping up. And Buddha nature is a way of describing that no-thingness that I was talking about. And it's like there's an essence of being here. It's not that, it's not that when we wake up, everything disappears. It's kind of the emergence into life of this Buddha nature. And the Buddha nature is already here and manifest, but as we get ourselves out of the way, it becomes more transparent and clear. So if you will, that's in a sense like the Holy Spirit. of the Christ nature within us. It's very analogous to that. It's like Buddhists don't believe in God, but actually, I think it's easier to say that the Buddhist faith doesn't have a creator God. Even that's a little opaque, because what really is creation? Because I'm here, But it's really easy to get, and a lot of Buddhists get stuck on this. They say, I don't believe in God. But then they're quite okay with this Buddha nature thing, which really, so the resident minister of the Vedanta Center, and we were having dinner with a group of people one night, and he said, this Atman is that within which everything exists. It's like, that's just looking at Buddha nature from the other side. It really is. So out of that grew a whole wealth of different strands. There's Pure Land Buddhism, which, there's this idea of reincarnation or rebirth, which is a very complicated idea, and we may go there, but there's a lot of red herrings in there too. One belief system came up that there are lots of Buddhas born over time, and we could just get born in the Pure Land, reborn in the Pure Land, and that's a lot like a view of a heaven or a Jannah in the Islam. So that's a Buddhist faith. And then there are others. There are, coming out of the compassion practices, there's an idea of all these bodhisattvas in the world who, in a sense, they relate to saints in Christianity. They're not the same, because saints are actual people for the most part, but these are like stylized, if you will, idealized people. And they're models for us. But in some traditions, those essentially become almost divine, and people will pray to the bodhisattvas to intercede in the world. Avalokiteshvara, or Kuan Yin in China, is one of those, and there are sects which relate to Avalokiteshvara in that way. Buddhism kept going west. I mean, they went into Vietnam and Korea, and at the same time it went south, and so you've got the Theravadan traditions that went across Southern Asia, and those are yet another flavor, but the ones we're probably more interested in came across through Japan, and then you've got Zen, and Zen grew out of Chinese practice, the gist of which was, well, you guys have spent 1,200, 1,500 years making this incredibly complicated, and it really isn't that complicated. We're going to throw all that junk away and go back to basics. So Zen it's actually, I have characterized it before as the most intellectual of all anti-intellectual movements I've come across, because it's really very much in the head, a lot of it, but it is in other ways very stripped down. But it is very attractive to a lot of people in the West. And then you've got the other traditions that came across the South, which are much more from the original, what most folks think of as the original Buddhist teachings, which are very large collections of sutras. And those are, that's the place where Jack Kornfield, who you mentioned at the beginning, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, some of the names you may have heard as American Buddhist teachers, many of those were trained in those Southern Asian traditions. So they brought that across to the States, and then Zen came across to the States. And then the other one that came across is one of the sutras, or the teachings of Buddha, is called the Lotus Sutra. And that is very spacey, lots of flowers flying in the air, and it's very beautiful, and I find it very meaningful. But in about the 1700s, no, it's actually as early than that, about the 1400s, there was a guy who worked with that sutra and really reduced much of the practice of the sutra to just chanting the title. So this is Tina Turner. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, and people will just chant that over and over and over, and that's the title of the Lotus Sutra, because well, there are reasons why that is believed to be an appropriate practice for them, but the practitioners of that, there are several sects grew out of that in Japan. That was a Japanese practice. The Lotus Sutra was very popular in China for a period of time. Then that chanting practice came out of Japan. And the Soga Gakkai is a tradition we have over here, where that's their practice. That's Tina Turner. And they are very engaged in the world. They're not people who sit and stare at the wall. They're people who go out and build hospitals and shelter the homeless and feed the food insecure and so on and so forth. Next.
There was a question about belief, whether or not you hold non-violent beliefs, if there are any sort of like dietary choices that come along with that, like being vegan or vegetarian.
I am mostly vegetarian, and it is mostly, you know, as a choice, I'm vegetarian. Somebody gives me meat, I'll eat it. The most disrespectful thing you can do to an animal is kill it, put it on a plate and not eat it, as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, given my choice, I'm going to be vegetarian, but I will occasionally just eat meat. If you go back to the old days, what the original Buddha and his original followers used to do, and this is still practiced in a lot of places, they go out with their begging bowls in the morning. Once a day, they go out with their begging bowls and they knock on 7 doors. Whatever is put in their bowl is their food for the day. So if somebody's cooked meat, puts meat in their bowl, that's what they have. They're just not picky. So the most important elements of diet, to me, as a Buddhist practitioner, the most important elements of diet are mindfulness and respect. It's like the Native Americans, when they would kill an animal, would kneel down and thank the animal for giving its life. That's real respect. You know, going to the back of the grocery store and getting a little plastic pannet with a little diaper on it and a piece of meat that you pretend wasn't ever an animal. That's not treating it with respect the same way, right? Violence, yeah, very much non-violence. But that's got a practical side too. Because that's not to stand aside and it's not to stand aside in the face of violence. It's the practice of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King to stand up for justice, and very strongly stand up for justice. But just not to get out guns and shoot people. And it is also in a society where occasionally you get people who are just serially violent. And it's really not smart to let those folks run rampant. So as a practical matter, it makes complete sense to remove those people from daily society. So, you know, you take those people and put them in a place where they're not going to go hurt anybody. So, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam, he was very active in the peace movement in Vietnam, and he was actually banned. He was exiled from Vietnam. But the monks who were in his order, and he was kind of their boss, they'd go out and try and do compassionate acts to help people. And they were shot because they were on the wrong side. So this non-violence is not disengaged at all.
Another question that came up in the chat was wondering how Western Buddhism is different from Eastern Buddhism, and how white people can practice Buddhism without being appropriative.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So culturally, the West is different. So one of the things I meant to say when I was doing that little short history of Buddhism moving around the world is, as Buddhism has moved, you've got the core practices of Buddhism, which I break them down to just stopping and seeing. So the stopping is being non-reactive. Meditation is a practice of stopping, being very careful what you say and not speaking immediately is a practice of stopping. And once you've stopped, then you can start to see. And that seeing is what allows us to see the other side of an argument, what allows us ultimately to see through the fabric of views we've created. So there's the core practices, but as they move into different societies, those practices are absorbed into and adapt themselves to that environment and that set of pre-existing practices and beliefs. Much like Catholicism goes to Latin America and it meets the earth-based religions. And so the Virgin Mary becomes such an important figure in that world because she is kind of merged in with the Mother Earth view of the world, right? So the same happens to Buddhism as it goes around the world. It really does morph the practices into the local belief system. In the West, so one of the things that happens in most of the, well, in the Asian practices, the laity do not meditate. You get the monastic community go up on the hill in the big building, and they do the meditating for us all. And then we give them food and donations, and then, you know, we show up for New Year celebrations or whatever. But it's, and we have a little altar at home maybe that we'll pray to. In the West, it's much more individuals jumping into the practice themselves and meditating. And the separation between the monastery and the laity is not the same. In the Asian traditions, you have this history of these enlightened masters who are like the gurus, right? And so you get realized individuals or spiritual leaders. Ideally, they're realized, self-realized individuals, but not always. So you'll have these people who head up communities, and folks will submit themselves to that person's authority as students. So there's a profound act of surrender in doing that. Now, in a society which is communally based and not individualistic in nature, that has a different flavor because the individual is much less likely to be taken advantage of that power structure. In the West, where we're raised with much stronger sense of identity, individual identity and individual ego, that can go sideways in a heartbeat. And so that has been tried. It is still practiced over here, but there are a lot of stories within Buddhism, within Hinduism, within, I don't know, within Sufism, but to the extent there are Sufi orders over here, I would expect to find the same in those practices as well, of abuse by teachers who have been given this power and don't know what to do with it. So that's something that, that's actually one of the reasons for the founding of Red Clay Sangha, because we did not like that kind of power structure. And so we wanted a peer-led community for that reason. In the West as well, Buddhism has developed a much closer relationship with science. And it's not that Buddhism is opposed to science at all in the East, or I say in the East, it's west of us really, but in the Asian nations. But the nature of its emergence into the US, there's a strong intellectual bent in the West, and that has really merged with Buddhism in a kind of an ordinary way. So there's a lot more scientific conversation within Buddhism. And then the other piece of it is there's a secularization of Buddhism as well that's happening. So there's mindfulness movements, and a lot of therapy practices include mindfulness and meditation. So there's a lot of taking the Buddhist practices out of a spiritual place and putting them into a secular place.
Do you have opinions on like if there's a way to be appropriative in practicing?
Yeah, thank you for coming back to that. That's a very good question. Truthfully, it's an outstanding question. It's one I think about a lot in other realms, and I really haven't thought about it as in Buddhism. And it's a question that will actually inform a lot of what I think about going forward. Because in the past, I was a Zen Buddhist priest, and I wore the robes. I had, the symbolism of, you get the little white robe underneath, which is the little white robe is Japanese, and the gray robe on top of that is Chinese, and then the big brown robe, which you wrap around, is the original Indian robe. So that's culturally very Japanese. And so American Zen, which is very American in many ways, because it's kind of broken away from the Japanese Zen tradition, carries all those accoutrements. I do not wear special Buddhist clothes. I think there's a general structure in the Buddhist community of, you've got an altar and you've got a Buddha and you've got a candle. I don't regard those as appropriative. Those are fairly vanilla to just have a base to hold the community together. There is one point in there which really doesn't go to appropriation, but it goes to a variation of that theme, which is it's kind of the what color skin did Jesus have? Well, the Jesus we see is this lily white figure with blonde hair. No. So the Buddhas, a lot of the Buddhas we see, they look Chinese. Well, Buddha wasn't Chinese; he was Indian. Mm-hmm. So there is this racial acculturation that is going on with the Buddhist figures that one does need to be careful of. I think probably it's not to minimize the question, but a bigger question in that it is one that's more immediate, and it's one that currently has more visibility, is Buddhism has issues of privilege and of race embedded within it. Here I am. I'm a comfortably middle-class, overeducated white guy. You go around and you try and find a Buddhist to come talk to this group. Odds are 60% of the folks you find will look and sound like me, except they'll have American accents. 30% will be like me, except they'll be women. And then there'll be a minority that is not. So in some influential subsets of Buddhism in this country, there is a lot of work, a lot of energy being spent around shifting that, putting people of other, women and people of other racial backgrounds into teaching positions and position of influence. It's going to be a long road, but that's a real issue within Buddhism. And it's also, the language of Buddhism doesn't lend itself to, going and hanging around in an inner city school and trying to practice Buddhism with kids. It takes great skill to convert the language of Buddhism into something that works in that environment. And that's it. I mean, we should have great skill. We should be able to do that, and we should do that. We're just not doing it very well.
I have a
Oh yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. I was going to ask that because I think it's in some ways American Buddhism has a lot in common with Unitarian Universalism.
Yes.
We are both, tend to be highly educated, white, privileged group historically, and yet leaning on the liberal side of awareness and politics and so forth, and therefore struggle perhaps in our own unique way with our complicitness with white supremacy in this country, and maybe more than complicit, maybe just, full on benefit, full on
Be honest, right? Yeah.
benefit. We have as a group or denomination, if you want to call it that, struggled with that over the last number of years, and maybe making some progress, but it is certainly a journey. I think that so I am, and I think it is also a spiritual practice. I think we've addressed it as an intellectual thing, and the other out there, and those people who aren't like us, and so forth. But in recognizing that it is us, that we are all connected, and it is us. It is a spiritual practice, but I wonder if you could speak a little more to what your individual communities, the how, not just the sort of we need to do better, but how are you going about broadening Buddhism, or maybe that's not even a goal. It sounds sort of evangelical, but making it more welcoming to people who are. It's not just a privileged class.
Right. So I'll give a couple of thoughts about the general, then about the community, the work that's happened within my particular community. And then I'll just give, so I'll wax eloquent on this individually, because I think well, you'll get the point when I get there. So in the broadest sense, there are first and second generation immigrant Buddhist communities that pretty much keep to themselves. So I live in Clarkston, and near where I am, just out to the other side of Stone Mountain, and then in Clarkston, there are 3 or 4 communities. There's a Bhutanese community in Clarkston. There's actually a couple, and they are culturally Bhutanese. They speak Bhutanese. I mean, that's the religion, literally, of their fathers and mothers. And they don't advertise. They invited me a couple of times to things they've done, and and there was a little bit of trophying going on there with the guy who invited me. He wanted me to wear my robes. And I said, I'm not going to do that. No, it's just wrong. And when I didn't wear that a couple of times, he didn't invite me anymore. So it's just, it's a funny thing, because they really keep themselves to themselves. And then there's a couple of Vietnamese Buddhist places just down the street, and I can't even figure out. I mean, I wanted to get them involved in some interfaith work here in Clarkston, and I couldn't even figure out how to contact them. So there's that, right? And then you have Soka Gakkai, which is really interesting. I mentioned Soka Gakkai, which is this Lotus Sutra offshoot. In very simplistic terms, you had the American GIs coming home with their Japanese brides, and you had a very interesting, and a lot of the GIs were African American. And so you had a very interesting racial mixing going on in the formative days of SGI. So SGI actually is reasonably diverse, but they are very insular. There was a guy from SGI got involved with, we got one of their guys to come and potentially join the Interfaith Atlanta board several years ago. And then we said, well, you're a board member, and we like to have our board members make donations themselves. Not a lot, like $50 or something, to make a donation yourself, and ideally see if your community would make a donation. I said, what? I give all my money to SGI. We never saw him again. So they're kind of insular. And that's not to disparage that, that's just to describe a reality of that community. The larger group that I am most broadly associated with is the Spirit Rock, which is the Ajahn Chah Thai forest tradition, which is the insight tradition in this country. That is a large cluster. It is dominantly white in its history and its leadership, but there are a reasonable number of African Americans and of people of other races who have become participants. And within the leadership of that organization, it is a large organization, there is a lot of intentional work to create retreats for people of color, to create training programs for people of color, with the view of advancing those people's teaching capabilities and leadership capabilities so that the next generation will have greater representation of that population. We'll see how that goes, but that's very promising and very encouraging. Our community, we're not a large community, Red Clay Sangha. On a typical Sunday, there's 15 or 20 of us, something like that. Our membership is probably 30, 40, and the total number of people who cycle through over a course of 6 months, it's like 20, but it's not always the same 20. There's probably 50, 70 people, something like that, within our larger community. The majority of us are white. There are a number of folks who are not, but the majority of us are white. And for the most part, what happens is, like you were saying, I'm assuming, Kay, like you were saying, we are people who want to do the right thing. We want to, open our doors, and we do open our doors. But if you're a person of color, and you were raised with a different culture, and you come into this space where you've got a bunch of intellectual white folks, it's just not feeling like a place you really want to hang out. So the flow isn't coming into our space. We have done things like a few years ago, we took, 30, 40 people. It was before COVID, so it'd be 3 or 4 years ago. We took 30 or 40 people down to the EGI lynching stuff in Montgomery. And then we had a justice and equity group that met every month on a Sunday afternoon with a view to breaking that down, and decided after a while that needed to be intentionally a group of white folks to work through our stuff and not pick on the single black person who shows up, kind of thing. So we've been doing that kind of work. My own personal belief, coming out of a lot of time in interfaith, is we can never really make our place. You can't invite people in and expect them to come, because the only people who are going to come in are going to be the outliers of that other community anyway. What we need to do is we need to just go to other places. And this is something I started to do several years ago in the interfaith world. I used to, at least every other week, go to one of the African-American masjids on a Friday afternoon for their Friday Juma. And there's one which is down near the stadium. It's Al-Mu'minun. And they generally have people come in and serve lunch afterwards. So I'd go there for Juma and hang out afterwards and have lunch and just participate in those conversations. And then I would often go to a synagogue on a Friday night. And on one occasion, somebody invited me over to their house for Shabbat that night for their dinner after the Shabbat service. So I think success in this looks like being really intentional and going out individually, or just in, no more than 2 people, because if you go in 5 or 6, then it's a mission. But it's going out 1 or 2 at a time and participating in the other communities and just seeing where it goes. Buddha, there's a saying in Buddhism, see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Because what that's about is the mature Buddhist, we talk about no stories and letting go of your attachments. The mature Buddhist has let go of the label of Buddhism. Even that's not a thing anymore. Because it's about helping people move through and move beyond their suffering. And you don't need labels to do that. You need compassion to do that. So in that sense, Buddhism is a practice of moving us deeply into compassion. And then we go into the world with that. And we don't need the label Buddhism. And we respond as the situation calls us to respond. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Thank you.
This is a little bit of a different tack, but there's a question in the chat about asking you to expand on what your comments on nonviolence. And they're wondering if there's a nonviolent community, what happens when there's an outside power that preys on that nonviolent community. And if there are aspects of Buddhism that acknowledge that someone might need to be a guardian for others.
I'll answer that obliquely first, and then I'll come back to the question. So I recently watched a movie. It was on for one night only at a bunch of theaters around town, and it was Never Forget Tibet. And it was the story of the Dalai Lama's escape. It was a god-awful movie, let me tell you. It really was. Such a great idea, but so badly executed. But the story is an amazing story. And some people didn't make it out. So the Dalai Lama's doctor ended up in a Chinese jail for many years, and he was tortured, grotesquely tortured. Eventually, he managed to escape from that, and he made his way over the Himalayas, and it was a journey that took months. And he's lucky to make it out alive. But eventually he got down to Dharamsala, and after he'd recovered physically, he was asked, why are you crying? He said, I'm crying for my jailers. Why? Because they were torturing me. And this is from a man who believes profoundly in karma and the impact of our karma on our future, and particularly on future rebirths. He said, because what they were doing was condemning themselves to this terrible future. How awful that is. So where we go with this practice, and it's not unique to Buddhism, it's across all the world's major faith traditions, where we go with this practice is we truly end up losing ourselves in compassion for the other. In Christianity, there's a saying that I picked up in Christianity, which is hate the sin and not the sinner. So nonviolence is first and foremost about that attitude. It's first and foremost, to me, about not bringing judgment to bear on other people. There's a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, Call Me By My True Names. If you've never read it, I would encourage you to look it up. Just scribble it down and go look it up afterwards. Call Me By My True Names. And in that poem, he says, I am the frog on the lily pad. I'm the fly that the frog catches with its tongue as it flips it out. I am the teenage girl or the pubescent girl in Somalia. And I am the Somalian pirate who rapes her. I'm the girl who jumps over the boat, over the side of the boat, because she can't stand it anymore. And in that, there is the metaphor or the sense of there but for the grace of God, if I were raised differently, in a different time and place, maybe that would be me. But there is also the reality that that person really is me. We are inseparable. We come out of the same stardust. I would not exist if that person did not exist. We are so inseparable. I am that person. And again, common to all faiths, Jesus said, whatever thou doest unto the least of them, thou doest unto me. And I don't think that was a figure of speech. That's an actual physical experience. So again, nonviolence comes out of that, right? And it comes out of respecting life, respecting humanity, and truly loving unconditionally. Now, what do we do with that? If somebody shows up into a religious space with a gun and starts shooting, what do we do? Do we all just sit around and let ourselves get shot? Some people might choose to do that. I would not. I don't know what I do because you can't judge yourself until you've been in that situation. But I like to think I would try and grapple that guy to the ground and get the gun out of his hand. I wouldn't exercise undue violence, and I wouldn't, then grab the gun out of his hand and shoot him. But I would act in a way that intentionally tried to minimize the harm, and it would require some action. Am I getting to the question?
Yes, I think so.
It was my question, and I guess in the real world, there's going to be situations where the nonviolent response and everything you described, which I believe in, and I would like to think I can practice myself, is just not going to work. We talked earlier about what's happening in the Ukraine. If you don't fight against what's happening there, how do you rationalize your behavior? So aren't there circumstances where you're going to have to face up to that? And you pretty much answered the question. You would try to get the gun away from him. But isn't that kind of the practical response to what I asked?
You've also, by clarifying where you're coming from, Bill, you've opened it up in a way that is helpful to me, dilating a little bit as well. So are there things you would just not do? Because there are things I would just not do. I would rather die than do certain things. I would rather die brutally, miserably, and in excruciating pain than respond to situations in certain ways. And as I get older and as my practice deepens, the list of things I'm not willing to do is growing. So that is moving me deeper and deeper into a path of nonviolence where there are certain modes of response that are just not accessible to me. The Ukraine is a really interesting one, and it really does get to an incredibly important point here. Two incredibly important points. One is we see a problem in the world, and I'm not diminishing what's going on in the Ukraine. Don't get me wrong at all. This is just by way of sort of example around it. In the world, we see a problem, and we have this habit these days anyway of owning the whole problem and wanting to fix the whole problem. It's just the way we respond. Now, there's a teaching I'll quote, which is the Brahma Viharas, loving kindness and compassion and those kind of things. So there's 4 of them. And there's a particular Burmese teacher who says, the Brahma Viharas are like a mother with 4 children. So first child is an infant. Mother's holding the child in its arms and rocking it, and she wants the child to grow up well and healthy. That is loving kindness. And if you've heard of metta practice, that's loving kindness. The second child is an infant. It's not an infant. It's 3-4 years old. It's sickly. Mother wants it to get better. Is trying to get medicine and whatever to help the child. That's compassion, wanting to intercede to help reduce somebody's suffering. Third child is a teenager, starting to date, doing well in exams, starting to play in the ball teams, having lots of wonderful things happening in her life. And the mother is getting excited and happy with that child as the child experiences those things. That is sympathetic joy, which is the third of the Brahmaviharas. The fourth child is an adult. He's married, got kids of his own, got a job, things are going well. Every now and again, there are bumps, but he's a big boy. He can figure it out. And he would rather figure it out than have mum come in and help him. So the mother loves him very dearly. She's there for him, but she doesn't interfere. That's equanimity. So with our children, we naturally do this. We naturally let our role with the children mature as the child grows into adulthood. But we have the hardest time doing that with global warming, with Ukraine, with Syria, Iraq. We have the hardest time. So part of the answer to your question is the stepping back from that precipice of I've got to solve the problems and taking a closer look at what's really going on. What is an appropriate response? The second part of it is there is a wonderful, it's like a 2-hour YouTube interview with a guy whose name I have completely forgotten, who is a Russian journalist who spent a lot of time on American TV. And it's a very, he's not talking from the Russian standpoint. This is 2 years ago, and it's a very objective presentation by somebody who is utterly disillusioned with what's going on, and he's very scared. So 2 years ago, he gave this presentation to Yale in which he said, US policy created Putin. And he looks at the history of US policy. He looks at the history of NATO expansion against promises by Baker and others, and makes what I think is a compelling argument that if you were in Russia, you would probably want to do this. And I'm not justifying it, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying it's a much more complicated story. And once we start to step back, let go of, I'm educated, I'm from the West, I understand how things work, I'm American, and open ourselves up to the possibility that there are other views out there, the picture gets a lot more complicated. And simple actions end up not being quite as simple. Again, not to condone it, Bill, but just to make it more difficult.
I've been wondering, I know I read in your bio that you have a pretty consistent meditation practice, and I'm wondering how you see meditation as being sort of like a practice of Buddhism, right? Like what role does it play in your life, in Buddhism as a whole? What are the different philosophies related to that?
Meditation is a universal spiritual practice. It's foundational to, it is perhaps the fundamental tool in the spiritual toolkit that moves us down the path of reduction of ego, shall we say. And what piece I missed out of my own bio is in the middle there, as I was sort of wallowing about what to do after I had stubbed my toe. I read The World's Great Religions by Houston Smith, and he reviews, it's a wonderful book. He reviews the 3 religions of the book, the Sanatana Dharma Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhi, Taoism, Native American religions. And he draws the conclusion that each of those religions is founded upon a set of practices that intentionally cultivate the loss of sense of self and surrender of that into some kind of divinity, into something that's great. So that's something that we have in all of our faiths. And meditation is, to me, the primary tool that we use in that practice. It takes many forms. My own practice, it's shifted over the years. But I talked about stopping and seeing. Those are the two fundamental practices within meditation. And if you sit still, you can, external sensory inputs. It's like sitting in a sensory deprivation tank, right? All your sensory inputs eventually get cut off. And so you're sitting there and it's just what's going on in your head. And you notice the arising, abiding, changing, and cessation of your thoughts. And eventually some of those stop when you get these still periods and then they start again. So there's this ability to start seeing more clearly what I am, how I work. And there are a lot of different approaches to meditation. Lectio Divina is one of them. Having an object, you can have a picture of a guru in front of you. You could take a line of scripture and just see where that, contemplate the line of scripture. There are practices, Tibetan Buddhist practices of visualization. Chanting is actually, the Namo Myoho Renge Kyo is a chant. But chanting actually opens up that same meditative space. And in most Christian circles, what I call meditation would probably be called contemplation rather than meditation. It's a word that got screwed up in the early translations. So that's what it is, and it's a really important part of my life. I mean, it's completely changed my life. If anybody did not have a meditation practice and wanted to start a meditation practice, my advice would be, number one, create a space. Get rid of that excuse. Oh, I wish I could meditate. And then get up in the morning. Well, I've got to get a cushion out or a chair. Get that excuse out of the way. Clear a corner of a room, set it aside. It's a chair or a cushion or whatever it is. It's always there. Number two, commit to a small practice. Don't say, I'm going to meditate for half an hour every day. Say, I'm going to meditate for 5 minutes twice a week. And pick a time that's convenient. So, you're going to get up in the morning. Get up 5 minutes earlier on a day where you don't have pressing commitments. So make it easy for yourself. And then number three, be kind to yourself. Because you're going to say, yeah, Tuesday's a good day and Friday's a good day. I'm going to meditate Tuesday morning and Friday morning. And then Monday turned out to be a dreadful day. So Tuesday you have a lie-in and you wake up and you're in a terrible rush. And you feel awful because you're not going to do your meditation. Be kind to yourself. Because if you can't be kind to yourself, how can you possibly be kind to anybody else? Just go over and touch your cushion or your chair and say, thank you. I know you're there. It means a lot to me. You're there. I'll be back. And then go off and do what you got to do.
That's all great advice. There is a question in the chat about helping people, and particularly kids with ADHD, learning to meditate. Is that would it be similar advice, or do you have particular?
It's very similar advice. There's two things I would add. One is meditation is only one breath at a time. You can only meditate one breath at a time. People come on like a 3-5 day retreat. They've never done it before. If you think about 5 days, you're not going to make it. If you think about the next breath and then the next breath and then the next breath, it's totally different. So really work on it being one breath at a time. Kids with ADHD do meditate and get a lot of peace and fulfillment out of the practice. There's a wonderful young man I know. Well, he's not a young man anymore. There's a wonderful guy I know who I've not spoken with him in a year or maybe a couple of years, but he was doing a lot of work taking meditation into school situations. And these were exactly the things he was dealing with. And his mantra was one breath at a time.
We are all caught up on questions in the chat. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask, either in the chat or out loud? Go for it.
I'm curious.
Oh. Okay, go for it.
How are or close are behaviors like rosary beads and prayer beads and running or painting, or doing other behaviors that require concentration? How close are they to meditation?
So a central element of meditation or contemplation is concentration. So being able to center the mind and keep it in one place is really important. Activities that engage that concentration can be meditative in nature, but they are, as long as one is actually focused on the outcome or on the thing itself, then that's too much in a sense, right? It's not to say don't do it, but for a mature meditation practice, that's too much. I gave a list of, have a picture of your guru, visualization, whatever. There are lots of things one can, follow your breath, count your breath. There are lots of things one can do, but as one's practice matures, what tends to happen is the objects start fading away and you end up with just meditating. There's no object, there's no subject-object distinction. It's just meditating. So, yeah, that's enough on that one, I think. You're on mute, Kay.
I once had an experience bird watching when I came back from it.
Yeah, absolutely. They can, yes. And you can have that experience when you watch the sunrise over the Grand Canyon, right? I mean, you can just disappear into that. So there can be gateways into it, but in themselves.
I've only had it that one time, that it was that noticeable one time. I keep trying to recreate it, but it does have a lot of moving parts to it. So.
Yeah. Well, the thing that you can't, if you try and recreate it, you're almost guaranteeing it's not going to happen. Yeah. But all you can do, so Shunya Suzuki, who was the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, said, waking up is an accident. You can't make it happen. But we can make ourselves accident prone. And we make ourselves accident prone by continuing to practice this meditation or whatever it is that creates that stillness in our life. Because if you think about it in these terms, what happens is we're thinning the veil as we practice. And it's not just during the practice. If we do it often enough, when we come back into the world, there's less there. So we're just working, that is a continuing thinning of the veil, and things are much more likely to burst through that.
Jill has asked something in the chat, which is, and I remember you mentioned it at the beginning, and I was going to ask you about it. So I'm glad that someone said something in the chat, which is, can you tell us more about what happens after death, and
Ah.
sort of in relation to your tease about reincarnation.
So it was going to come up, wasn't it? We almost got there. It was going to come up. Okay, so this is a very difficult point within Buddhism, and it's a very easy one to get completely sidelined on, because the idea of rebirth is like, what the heck is that? And then you read a bit more about Buddhism and you say, but you guys say there's no self. So if there's no self, what's reborn anyway? This is nonsense. And in a sense it is. So I guess we'll start with a core Buddhist belief, and it is founded on experience, is that this thing I call a self is not really what I think it is. Nisargadatta said, when you're born, your mother tells you, you're a little boy and your name's Gareth, and you believe her. And she keeps on saying it and saying it and saying it, and it gets more and more deeply ingrained into you. And so you've got this story of a self, and it's repeated and rehearsed and reinforced so much, you believe it. But it's just not true. And we all know the chemistry and the physics of this thing, these atoms aren't the atoms that were here 10 years ago, and I've got bits of the Dalai Lama in me and bits of Adolf Hitler and whatever, right? And this is literally made of stardust burst out of a supernova, right? So I'm entirely a creature, and then you get a little glass of the DNA that's in this sack of skin and bones, and the DNA that's in my own cells is a tiny fraction. The rest of it's DNA of all the microorganisms that are actually part of this complicated living thing. So I am not existent the way I think I am. It's not to say there's not a person sitting here talking to you all. There is, but it's just not what we all think it is. It is just the universe speaking to you. So, and our meditative experiences, and this is what Kay was talking about returning from when she was out bird watching. We get these totally immersive experiences where we are one with everything. And it's not this, you can't really describe it. It's like, what does a banana taste like? Until you've eaten a banana, you can't describe it to anybody. But you can really experience this loss of self. So in a universe where that's true, in a universe where we all know there is such a thing as cause and effect, there is an expedient means or a teaching tool that's called karma. Karma simply says, if you do bad stuff's out there and it will keep on propagating in some way, shape, or form. If you do good stuff's out there and it will keep propagating in some way, shape, or form. So there's a karmic thing going on. So karma is there, and that's the thing that continues forever. And you can think, I don't like the word karma, but the consequences of our behavior, the consequences of our action, that's out there forever. And that just shows up here. And there's a whole bundle of karmic activity or of causes and effects over time that show up as Gareth. So at some point, Gareth dies, dissolves back into the universe, the metaphor of the wave and the ocean. So Gareth settles back into the ocean. But if Gareth wakes up in this lifetime, Gareth knows. In fact, Gareth doesn't know. Gareth has disappeared. The ocean knows it's the ocean, and the ocean is awake and is showing up right here. And then the ocean settles back into itself, but that karmic stuff that's out there continues to show up. So that in an important sense, there is no rebirth, because there is nothing to be reborn. And yet, as long as there are 7 billion of us, or however many there are, wandering around in these spacesuits and thinking that we're real, there is this karmic stuff, and there's this ongoing cycle of this karmic stuff showing up again and again and again. So these are totally different stories. They're, in a way, both true. In a way, neither of them is true. And all of Buddhism, all of the things you hear people talk about in Buddhism, are just designed to be useful teaching tools. They're not real. And if they're not useful, throw them away and try something else. That's what Buddha would tell you. That's the best I can do with that question tonight.
It was great. The wave metaphor was a very helpful teaching tool. Kind of on that topic, somebody was asking about if Buddhism prevents any behaviors or asks like practitioners to do any particular things. Like, are there rules of things not to do, things to do that are part of your practice?
Yeah. I think every religion has a set of commandments or something similar, right? And we have the precepts. And guess what? Do not kill. Do not take that which is not freely given. There's a list of 10 of them. And in some circles, it's a list of 5. And in some monastic communities, it's a list of 50 or 100 or whatever, right? But yes, there are these moral principles. And they're important. It is fairly commonly understood that unless you're observing the precepts, your practice really isn't going to work because you've got too many obstacles in the way. So as just a simple, expedient matter of supporting your practice, you need to follow them. And then there is the fact that we are in the world and we are compassionate beings, and these are just simply a set of guidelines for compassion. But then, there are all sorts of strange teachings that spin off the precepts, right? We observe the precepts by breaking them. That can mean all sorts of things. I mean, on the one hand, it's a way of practicing mindfulness. We notice when we break them and we promise not to do it again. But you could do all sorts of things with that statement. And then another one would be anger, which is a really bad thing in Buddhism. But anger, our practice, isn't about ending anger. It's about transforming anger. So we kind of jump right into the anger. If not done wisely and in a well-structured environment, that can be a complete disaster. So yes, we have precepts. But Buddhism is this amorphous and really diverse tradition where they show up in lots of different ways, and not all of them, I'm afraid, are skillful.
We can take a few more questions, but just because we are just shy of 9 right now, I'm wondering if now would be a great time to do the poll. So we do a poll each week just to get some feedback on the speakers and the things that we're bringing in for Adult Religious Ed. So Carrie is going to launch this poll right now. If everyone would be willing to quickly fill out your responses. And then if you are finished with the poll, add any last questions that you'd like to ask before 9 o'clock into the chat, or unmute and ask them.
I think we have one about free will.
I'll give people a couple of seconds to do the poll and then ask that one. Okay, looks like that's a pretty good mass of people. So we've got maybe 2 more questions before we wrap up. So the first one is asking if you believe that humans have free will, or is the entirety of our lives and actions a cycle of cause and effect, which can't be broken?
Yeah, it's very complicated question. The simple answer is there is what I choose to do has a real impact. It makes a difference. Mm-hmm. This is not a purely defined universe. Mm-hmm. So in simple terms, yes, there is such a thing as free will.
Mm-hmm. And then the other question that's come up is, how do you sort of reconcile ridding yourself of attachment with social activism? Mm-hmm. Asking, isn't wanting to help others in attachment?
That's a topic that I actually I think is quite challenging right now, actually. So from a simple spiritual standpoint, we do not want to help others. The path is not to want to help others, because to want to help others is, you're right, it's to bring myself to the table. The path is to let stuff in, to open myself up, to allow myself to become vulnerable, and to let the world in. And once I let it in, then it's like if a child is crying, you just hug it. You don't think about it. You just hug it. And once you let the world in and you start seeing suffering really clearly, there is a natural response to be with that suffering and compassion. And that comes out of a very deep connection with our practice, which becomes a deep connection with this interconnected universe we're in. Where I find it challenging right now is all of the world's, well, the world's faiths, and all of us have a background, I'm confident, where some level of engagement in the world and some level of justice and equity is something we put energy and time into. But I know there's a couple of people in particular I think of who I have regular conversations with who testify to this in their livelihoods. They work for really well-known justice and equity organizations. And what they find, because they are deeply grounded in their faith, they approach their work from the basis of morality, the basis of their moral underpinnings, and they come at it from their faith first. And a lot of the time, they find themselves othered in those communities, in those organizations, because there is a level of militant behavior in those organizations where the tolerant are intolerant of the intolerant. For instance, one of them told me the other day of somebody in their organization, her boss came to her and said, "We've got to get rid of this person." Why? Because he said such and such, and this person. I guess I can see how that's triggering. But I can also see how that could be said innocently without recognizing that it could be triggering. Has anybody spoken to him? No. Why would we speak to that person? We don't want people like that in this organization. He's got to go. So justice and equity that is founded on militantism and on justice and equity for itself without the moral underpinning is a very dangerous thing. So, and there's a lot of that right now. And I think that's potentially quite harmful, unfortunately.
All right. Well, seeing the time, I think that we might wrap up here. But really hearty thank you to you, Gareth. This was a really interesting discussion. Great to hear about all of your experiences and thoughts. Just a quick note that we'll have one more interfaith speaker coming next Tuesday. And then the week after that is going to be an ARE break. And then one quick plug for our Saturday interfaith trips. Margaret has lovingly curated for us. The next trip is going to be to the BAPS Hindu temple on April 16th. So if you're interested in visiting that, you can find information in the weekly update. But yeah, so we'll see you all hopefully next week. And Gareth, one more big thank you to you.
Thank you all for participating and for your involvement. Enjoyed it a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.